Trevor? Ron? Okay, thank you. I take this moment to give an announcement. I will be in the back of the church after the service with posters for this wonderful event we have coming up with Jennifer Maloney. And if you live in a facility or you go to a beauty shop where they maybe have posters up and people will read them, we have them available for you. I also wanted to let you know that in addition to your being able to take out tickets, if you wish to check out tickets to sell to or promote with friends and clubs you belong to, we can do that today. But Eldon's also will be offering our tickets to people. We want to add some touches that are First Congregational Appreciation touches, and that is we want even our ushering to be special. And Julie Jelm is heading up the ushers. We need 3 more for each program, and if you would be willing to sign up, Julie will take you into the fold and tell you all the secrets and details of how to make ushering more fun for the event. And then we also need some people who are interested in helping with the social gathering. It was thought it would be fun to add the little touch of a cup of coffee and a cookie, not a breakfast, but just a cookie afterwards. And so I'll be back there if you're interested in helping with any of those areas, because we're being given this great gift. Since we're celebrating every blessing every day, it's a blessing, a big one for us, and we want to enhance it as much as we can. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome each and every one of you this morning to First Congregational UCC of Alexandria. Welcome to Alexandria's Community Church, where no matter who you are and no matter where you are in life's journey, you're welcome here. We're going to start our service by continuing to share our announcements about the life and mission of the church. We have new church directories with updated information available at the back of the church and ready for you to pick up. We only printed enough for 1 per family, so please grab just 1 for your whole family, but with those we'll be able to have more updated and current and recent information to communicate and get in touch with each other. The food share baskets in the Plymouth room are still there. If you have extra produce from your home gardens and are looking to do something good and productive with them, you can bring those to those baskets. And then if you want to take somebody else's produce, leave a donation in the basket, and we will use that money to help out the incoming students at ATCC as they start a new school year in September. Bountiful Basket this month is also going to go towards helping out ATCC students who could use a little bit of boost as they start a new school year. Also, the Bible study. Last week I expected 12 to 18 and there was 27 people there. This last week I planned on 32 and there was 38 people there. Word is out, this has become a big thing. Very cool. Show up, get involved, contribute your energy. Must be a real appetite for this material. So that'll be on Tuesday at 5:15. This week we're going to compare the miracle stories of Jesus from the Quran versus the miracle stories of Jesus in the Bible. And also, I think it's only 2 weeks now until our pet blessing service. That's going to be on September 1st. You are welcome, if it is appropriate, to bring your animals to church that day. You know your animals better than anybody else. You know them better than we do, so you know if it will work to bring them into the church on that day or bring them to the church. When our sanctuary service is done, we're going to go out on the south lawn and do the Feast of St. Francis, which is a blessing of the animals that are one of the ways in which we see God's love in the world. If you are only going to bring a photograph of the animal that does or has meant something and shown you God's love in their life, and you also want to bring or get me a digital copy, we can do a slideshow of those photos as well during the service. So that could be a fun thing to do. But pet blessing service, 2 weeks from today, should be a fun one. We're going to try something new and see how it works out. Other announcements to share? Then let's welcome each other here this morning for the passing of the peace. If willing and able, I invite you to stand or remain standing and join me in a spirit of prayer as we invoke God's blessing upon this gathering. God, who is as grand as the distant cosmos and as near to us as our own breath. Divine eternal mystery that is God, whose love never gives up on us and never, ever lets us go. We ask that you will use this time before us to build us up as your church. Help us to see your image in each other and remind us that we praise and honor you when we care for and love each other. Make us ready for the ways in which you're calling us to new places or familiar ones. May we be inspired and encouraged by the fact that you use us, even us, imperfect vessels that we are, to do your work. You trust us with the mission of caring for each other and for your world and for your church. And sometimes you even use the parts of our lives we don't like to talk about to show your love, to show your blessings, to pour out your Spirit upon us. Continue to make us ready. Continue to show us patience and second chances and grace that we might do your work in this time and place, that each of us might have a role in bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth. Amen.
Please join me in the responsive call to worship. I'll begin. It's on your screen. May God's grace inspire us once again to be receivers and also bearers of great love. Gracious God, we ask that your compassion will once again transform us. Empower us to live in divine ways, not in worldly ways. Grant us the strength to let go of what holds us back. We don't forgive others as readily as you forgive us. It does not come easy for us. When we feel wronged by those who are closest to us, we cling to the false comfort of our grudges. Too often we see forgiveness as a requirement or a chore instead of a gift that we give to ourselves. Remind us of Jesus' words and the power of forgiveness to bring peace to our souls. The first reading for today is Genesis 50, 15 through 23, when Joseph forgives his brothers. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave us instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept. They fell down before him and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Joseph's last days and death. So Joseph remained in Egypt, and he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, and the children of Machir and the son of Manasseh were also born on Joseph's knees. Here ends the reading.
Please be seated. Do we have young folks who are willing to come up for a children's message today? Good morning. So I'm going to give you a choice today. Do you want to have one of those Sundays where we act out a Bible story? Or do you want to learn about why we do that thing at the beginning of the service where we all shake each other's hands? You got one vote for learn. Okay, all right. Have you ever noticed what we call that at the beginning of the service? And not every church does it at the beginning like we do. But what do we say right before we turn and all start shaking each other's hands? It's called the passing of the peace. Why do we call it that?
We're spreading just love and just when we were there, it's nice to really have a moment where you really you're just meeting people or like saying.
Right?
Sometimes we can forget that. And we can,
You're right. It is just nice to have that time where we're just centering ourselves in the group and connecting with the people around us and reminding us that we're in the spirit of togetherness here as well. But there's another reason why we do it as well. Because we as Christians believe that one of the things that happens when we gather together in God's name, one of the things that happens when we come to church is that we receive God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's mercy. That, we make mistakes. We all do. Every human that ever lived did. And there's things where we probably don't do what God would have had us do. But we know that. And still, we come to church and we humble ourselves in that attitude, and as a result, we receive God's grace, God's forgiveness that won't run out on us. And that should be a weight lifted from our shoulders. The Hebrew word for forgive literally means to lift a weight off, to remove a burden. And so the feeling that gives us should be one of peace. And so we share that. We recognize that moment, and we share it with each other, and we come together in an attitude of peace inspired by God's grace and forgiveness upon us. Some churches have a moment in the service that they're really intentional in saying, this is when we do our confession, and this is when we recognize and are being intentional about lifting up God's grace, and that's when they do their passing of the peace. So we go around and we say, good morning, or God bless, or some people will even say, peace be with you, and things like that. But it's supposed to come from a place of, isn't it great that we've been forgiven so much? And so let's share that with others too. Why don't we practice that? Let's have a passing of the peace, all right? Peace be with you. Peace be with you, sir. Peace be with you.
The song I'm about to sing is a simple song called Simple Gifts. The words are, "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free." It's a setting by Aaron Copland, to be simple, because all of the piano chords fall in weird places in every measure. So the melody is very square and straightforward, but the piano chords are a little off kilter, just to remind us how difficult simplicity can sometimes be. Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right. Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight.
Our gospel reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Matthew. We are in the 18th chapter. These are verses 21 through 33. And then Peter came and said to him, that is, Jesus, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. This is an enormous sum of money. This is a fortune. This is more money than a working class person made in their whole life. And as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before the king, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for the man, the king of that slave released him and forgave him the whole debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. This is a lot of money, but nothing earth-shattering. This is probably about 3 months' salary for a working-class person. And he seized that person by the throat, and he said, "Pay what you owe." And then this fellow slave fell down and pleaded with the man, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. And then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. Now, when the fellow slaves saw what happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and they reported to their lord all that had taken place. And then the Lord summoned the man to him and said, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all." The Irish playwright Oscar Wilde once said that you should always forgive your enemies because nothing annoys them so much. And that's a funny thing to say, but I also think there's a lot of wisdom to that phrase. I also think there's a lot of wisdom to what Oscar Wilde said, because what's behind that phrase is this understanding that sometimes forgiveness isn't something we do for someone else's benefit. It's not something we do to be nice to the other. Sometimes it's just something we have to do for ourselves. Sometimes it's just a weight we have to take off of our own shoulders. Sometimes forgiveness has to be a gift that we give to ourselves to make our own life easier, to lighten our own load. The Bible, particularly the New Testament, particularly the teachings of Jesus, have a lot to say about forgiveness. Forgiveness is all over in these scriptures. It's clearly critical to Jesus' message and the message as his followers interpreted it. But we see it playing in lots of different dynamics. Like what we see in this king and slave dynamic, we have this idea of that recognizing how much God has forgiven us should make it easy for us to forgive others. As we attempt to reflect God's love for us, God's grace and forgiveness, that should make it much easier for us to be forgiving to other people as well. Someone once told me, it's the privilege of the forgiven to forgive. It's even in our Lord's Prayer, this idea that because of how much grace we've been shown, because God has given us so much patience and so many second chances, that it is only right that we pay that forward and that we show grace and forgiveness and love to others as well. There also is this idea in the Bible, certainly, of forgiving as a way of being nice to people, taking the burden of guilt off of people's shoulders as a way of showing them, of being kind, of being Christian to them, of wanting good things for other people. And that's in there as well. But what we definitely don't want to overlook is the ways in which forgiving can just be something we do just for yourself. The ways in which forgiving is something that is internal. And sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. But as we talk about this commandment, because Jesus' language here is very clear, Jesus is saying that forgiveness is something Christians should be doing. And it's bold, it's radical. He's going really far with this. A lot of the other rabbis would have said, oh yeah, if you forgive someone 2 or 3 times, that makes you a great Jew. You're doing so well, how godly of you. And Jesus is coming out with 77 times, which, by the way, it wasn't supposed to be a math equation. What he's saying is, don't keep score. If you're keeping score, that's not real forgiveness. So this is really bold. How can Jesus do this? How can Jesus make this outright command to forgive? Well, what we need to remember is that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. And they're both good things. Jesus likes forgiveness and reconciliation. Jesus preached about both, but he didn't think that they were the same thing, because forgiveness only takes one. Forgiveness only requires us to make that choice to forgive, to take that burden off of our shoulders. Reconciliation is different. Reconciliation requires both parties to be willing to come together, and one or both to be willing to maybe admit that they did something wrong. Maybe willing to apologize. Maybe willing to create some new norms for the future. We can't choose to reconcile with people if they're unwilling, but we can choose to forgive. That doesn't require anybody else to do anything. Forgiveness is just something we do for ourselves. These definitions that I wrote up here, these are just, I came up with these. I didn't borrow them from any source. But forgiveness, this personal decision that we are not going to seek opportunities to get even or otherwise give our energy to someone who has wronged us, deciding that this thing that happened in the past is not going to influence my future. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. So instead, this energy that I've been devoted to looking for a chance to get even, I'm going to let that go, and I'm going to give that to something productive, something that feeds me, something that builds up my life. Whereas reconciliation requires multiple parties to reestablish a previous relationship and renew trust, so that cooperation and harmony are restored. Forgiving someone does not necessarily mean trust is restored. Forgiving someone doesn't necessarily mean forgoing the process of seeking justice. It just means that this energy that I've been given to somebody who wronged me, to this grudge, to this feeling that I've got to, be seeking out revenge, letting that go. The Hebrew word literally means to lift a weight from our shoulders. And Jesus knew that forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. That passage you just heard me read, that is Jesus talking about forgiveness. This is Jesus talking about reconciliation. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, and you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen even to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one to you be as a Gentile and a tax collector. Keep in mind, Jesus' mission very much included the Gentiles and the tax collectors. Truly I tell you, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Because when Jesus is talking about reconciliation, he has to include these practicalities. He has to include this idea that some people just are not going to be willing to reconcile with us, and we can't control that. We can't control what other people do. But when he talks about forgiveness, he says, go for it. Radical. Always, he says 77 times, which is this number that would have symbolized just a huge number to them, a number higher than one could keep track of in a ledger. Because forgiveness is something we do within ourselves and for ourselves. One of the smarter things I've heard about forgiveness actually comes from this really old Proverbs book from a guy whose name I can't remember. Can you put the slide up? Remember the guy's name? His name is George Herbert. And he was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he wrote these long proverb books with lots of quotes in them. So it's likely he didn't say this first, that he might have been quoting somebody else. But George Herbert said, the best revenge is being happy. And I think that's true. I think instead of giving our energy to these people in a way that holds us back, the best thing we can do is just move on with our lives and live well. I want to say his exact quote was something like, living well is the best revenge. So, with these ideas in mind, this idea that the best revenge is being happy and that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, and yet Jesus does have this command to always forgive for our own benefit as much as anything. I want to read through the Joseph story as we heard it and see the way in which these themes come up. So, as a reminder, Joseph is the 11th of 12 brothers. He was Dad's favorite, and the rest of the brothers were not happy with that. They didn't like the special treatment he got. They didn't like all the extra attention and privilege and preferential tasks. And they especially didn't like that Joseph seemed to believe that he had this gift to interpret dreams. And so they sold Joseph to slave traders, and he ended up in Egypt. But now the table is turned. Now Joseph has found himself rising through the ranks of the Egyptian court. He is now the second most powerful man in Egypt. The only person in the whole country he answers to is Pharaoh, and when Joseph gives a command, it is as good as Pharaoh gave it himself. And then the brothers have come back, fleeing a famine. They're in Egypt asking for food, and they find the guy who's in charge of giving out food to foreigners to be the brother they treated so harshly. So they go back and they get the rest of the family, the rest of the clan, and they bring them down to Egypt. And things seem to be going all right. And here we have another example of forgiveness and reconciliation not being the same thing. In fact, in the Genesis story, they are two different stories. Genesis 50 is where you'll usually see the heading, Joseph forgives his brothers. But if you go back to Genesis 45, you'll often read the heading, Joseph reconciles with his brothers. And in fact, this scene that we see up here is the first one. This is the moment where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and says, go get Dad, go get the rest of the family, I'm going to take care of you, things are going to be okay. This is reconciliation. This is a restoration of trust and of togetherness in this relationship. In the Joseph story, it's very difficult for me not to see my own father. My dad was the 11th of 12. Whereas in the Joseph story, they all have the same father, but there's 4 different mothers. And my dad's, it was the opposite. Him and his siblings all had the same mother, but there was 5 different fathers. My dad's mom was married 5 times. And my dad was estranged from most of his brothers. 9 of his 11 siblings, he had made the conscious decision, I'm just not going to see them anymore. They're not good for me. By the way, estrangement is way more common than we think it is. Because people don't talk about it. And because people don't talk about it, in fact, they shouldn't talk about it, people don't realize how common it is, even people who have it. Half of all Americans have a family member that either they have made the intentional choice to stop communicating with, or somebody has done that to them. Half of all Americans are estranged from a family member. My dad never reconciled with his brothers, but I hope for his sake that he forgave them. I can't know that for sure, but I hope he did. So we have first this reconciliation story, and then the family gets taken care of. Jacob, their father, gets used to being in Israel. He gives them this speech, but then Jacob goes the way of all things and shuffles off the mortal coil, and Jacob dies. And this is where we realize what we had before was only reconciliation, not forgiveness. The weight of guilt and the fear of seeking vengeance was never addressed and never assuaged. Joseph's brothers, realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if he still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" They are worried, what if Joseph's only been nice to us for Dad's sake? What if, without Dad in the way to be heartbroken by seeing his boys fight, what if now Joseph is going to seek revenge? What if now he's going to remember all the terrible stuff that we did to him and try and even the score? They're anxious, they're afraid, they're worried. They narrowly escaped famine, and now their life could come crumbling down all over again. So they talk to each other. What if Joseph still bears a grudge? What if he tries to pay us back now? And so they approach Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." We don't know if they're being honest here. We don't know if they made this up or if Jacob really did say these things. They've done dishonest things in the past. And actually, in the preceding chapters, Jacob talks a lot. We get a lot of words of Jacob. So it would have been pretty easy for those words to be in this text if they were then going to repeat them as being Jacob's words. So maybe they are saying something Jacob did say, maybe they're not. Maybe they're just trying to pressure Joseph. Either way, what we have here is what systems theorists call a triangle. So systems theory is all based on this idea that anxiety is contagious. In fact, anxiety is the most contagious thing that there is, and it is impossible not to be affected by the anxiety of people around us. And systems theory says that if your relationship with somebody else is anxious, if it is unstable and causing you stress, we have a natural human instinct to triangulate that relationship, to find something else and say, well, because of through this, you have to behave in ways that are predictable to me, and that makes sense. To use a third point to gain leverage on somebody else and stabilize the relationship in that way. In this case, they're using Jacob, Joseph's father. But the problem with triangles is that they don't cure the anxiety. They just spread it somewhere else. Because now the one triangulated in is probably going to make another triangle somewhere else, and probably going to make another triangle somewhere else. And now nobody is communicating and addressing the relationships directly with each other. They're all just trying to get leverage by roping somebody else into the relationship. Systems theorists would immediately recognize what they're doing here as unhealthy. It would have been a much more genuine form of forgiveness if they had said, Joseph, we're sorry. We messed up. What we did wasn't okay. And we can't make it okay. But here we are, and I guess it'd be pretty cool if you forgave us. That would have been a more honest way of going about this. It would have avoided the triangulation, and it would have actually addressed the anxiety instead of just throwing it somewhere else. Joseph weeps when they speak to him, and personally, I think that's why. I think the reason Joseph is weeping is because he's saying, you brought Dad into this? You couldn't just come to me and ask for forgiveness? You had to try and make it Dad's dying wish to do so? I think Joseph recognizes how unfair that is to him and how unjust it is. But Joseph knows that forgiveness is something he can do for himself to build himself up and make his own life easier. When they see him weeping, they're worried. They think that they upset him and they think that they're in trouble. We are here as your slaves, they tell Joseph. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? There's a kind of a let go and let God thing going on there. When he says, it's not up to me to forgive you. That's between you and God. And I'm just going to let go and let God and keep on with my life. And keep loving other people because of who I am, not because of who they are. And then he says something that really should stand out. He says, even though you intended to do harm for me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. Now, this is tricky because this opens up this theological window for people to say, oh, well, your suffering, your abuse, your grief, that was all just part of God's plan. I don't believe that. I don't buy that. The word here that is translated intended, in Hebrew, that word also means weaved. And so when Joseph says, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, I see that instead as God weaving something back for the good of God's people. I think we're really good at getting off God's plan. I think we're tremendously good at it. And God will lay out things that will go well for us in our tov, the way things are good, the way things are supposed to be, and we mess it up. But that even when we mess it up, God is able to say, oh, I'm going to weave that back over here. I'm going to weave that back over here. And you end up with a tapestry. You end up with something that is still beautiful, despite it not being the way things would have been if those mistakes hadn't happened. I personally think this is part of how we have to see the cross and the crucifixion. There's certainly a biblical case to be made that it was God and Jesus' plan from the very beginning for Jesus to be crucified. But when I read a text like this, I wonder about that. I wonder if that's true. I mean, Jesus prayed for it to be spared from him if that was possible. I wonder if instead of Jesus being sent to earth to be crucified, if we mess up the plan and we crucified him, and God is able to say, well, even this, I'm going to weave it back in for the good of the people. I'm going to make something productive and loving even out of something like that. So Joseph tells his brothers, have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. And in this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. And I added these last two verses at the last minute. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation, that's his son, and the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, so that would be his grandson, were also born on Joseph's knees. In an Old Testament world, having a long life with lots of years, and meeting your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, and having lots of descendants that are going to carry on your name was equivalent to success, was equivalent to living well. And so what I see in those two verses is Joseph saying, the best revenge is being happy. The best revenge is living well. Amen. And now is the time in our service that we share our prayer requests and our joys and our concerns, that they can be lifted up in prayer as one community I have one to start with. I want to make sure that we remember our sister Elaine Crassus in our prayers today. Elaine took a fall this week. She spent a few days in Alamere. By now, she's probably been transferred to Bethany, which is where Jim is, so they'll get to be in Bethany together, at least for a while. This is obviously a very stressful time for both of them, for the family. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty and needing to lean on other people and get a whole lot of support in the near future for them. So let's lift up our brother and sister, Jim and Elaine, that they know that God walks through them and the church is still here for them, even through that time. Are there other prayer requests to share? Then I invite us to join together in a time of silent prayer, to lift up these and our unspoken prayers to God in our hearts and minds. God of all times and of all places, we give you thanks especially for your presence in the right here and the right now. We ask that when we gather together in your name in this place, that we will always feel your Spirit poured out upon us. May we never forget that we're your children, your people, that each of us have the costs and joy of discipleship as themes running through our lives. Help us to always do better tomorrow than we did today. Help us to always keep our eyes on the kingdom of heaven and the ways in which we can be a part of bringing it to earth. Jesus' words often challenged us. They often don't sound like ways in which we can behave in this world and still survive and not be taken advantage of. But may we be filled up with your Spirit, that we might have the strength and the faith and the courage to do it anyway. May each of us be an instrument of your love unleashed upon this world. May your love be poured out upon us and overflow out of us to all the people that we meet. When we have the strength to forgive or to reconcile, may we value those things and know that we're doing Jesus' work. And if we only have the strength to do one, may that maybe someday lead to the other as well. But may forgiveness be a tool in which we have to lighten our own burdens, to be liberated and freed, to be more easily and powerfully about your work in the world, unleashed upon the future instead of held to the past. We ask that you will pour out your Spirit upon our sister Elaine. May she know that you are with her now just as when things are easier, and that you work with her and for her and through her, and that maybe you can even weave hard times to do some good in the world. We ask that if we are the ones being called to be there for them, that we will have the grace and the strength and the courage to say, "Here I am," and to go. May they feel your love through the support of those around them. May they see your image in their caretakers, those who will offer service in your name or otherwise. And may people who are there for them, may the people that you have called to be in their life at this time, may they know that they are doing your work, that they are being your hands and feet in this world. We ask all this in the words that your Son taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, people of generations before us, who have given their all in faithfulness to God. Much is required of those who make a faith commitment. Much is required of us. We give, however, not out of fear or a sense of duty, but because it's a joyful opportunity to express our thanks for all we have received. Will the ushers please come forward? Join me in the unison prayer of dedication. Still speaking, God, we give something today in the hopes of participating in your work in the world. We wish to be a part of ending cycles of injustice, spreading the power of radical love, and seeking ways to bring something good even out of low places. Bless the gifts of our wallets to build up this church into a temple of grace and compassion. Guide what we offer of our efforts to build us up as disciples, guided by your Spirit, sharing the power of love with your children. Amen.
We have been called to share grace generously because we've been shown a grace that does not run out. Remember the joy of forgiveness in your life and spread it to the world through your deeds. May you move into a future free from the weight of the past and more focused on God's service. Being embarrassed about things you've done in the past, perhaps even apologizing or asking for forgiveness, does not mean that you're weak. It means you've grown as a person. And being willing to forgive others the same way you've been forgiven does not mean you're asking to be taken advantage of or forgoing justice. It means that you care enough about your future to not let it be weighed down by the past. It's a powerful tool to heal our souls and enrich our lives. So may each of you go out continually growing in God's love and grace, and continually enriching your future in God's service. Amen.